Picture this. It's 1951, and in a cramped laboratory in London, a young woman peers through a microscope at something that will change everything we know about life itself. Her name is Rosalind Franklin, and she's about to capture the most important photograph in scientific history. But here's the twist. The world won't know her name for decades. What she sees through that lens will unlock the secret of DNA, the blueprint of all living things. Yet, when the Nobel Prize is handed out for this discovery, 3 men will walk onto that stage. Rosalind's chair will remain empty. This isn't just another story about forgotten women in science. This is about Photo 51, a single X-ray image that revealed the structure of life itself. Rosalind Franklin was born in 1920 into a wealthy London family. While her friends played with dolls, she collected rocks and studied their patterns. At family dinners, she would ask questions that made adults uncomfortable.
Why do crystals form the way they do? What makes coal turn into diamonds?
When Rosalind was 15, she made an announcement that shocked her family. She wanted to become a scientist. Her father's reaction was swift.
Science is no career for a woman.
He told her,
You'll never find a husband if you spend your time buried in books and chemicals.
but Rosalind had inherited her father's stubborn streak.
Then I won't marry.
She replied calmly.
Science is more important to me than anything else.
This was 1935. Women like Amelia Earhart were making headlines, but most people still believed a woman's place was in the home. Rosalind didn't care what most people thought. At Cambridge University, she threw herself into chemistry. Her professors noticed something special. She could see patterns that others missed. But being brilliant wasn't enough. Male students got the best research projects. They were invited to important meetings while Rosalind waited outside. Did this stop her? Not for a second. In 1941, Rosalind graduated with honors. World War II was raging, but instead of seeking safety, she chose to contribute through science. She took a job studying coal's molecular structure, work that helped Britain make better gas masks and materials for the war. During those war years, Rosalind mastered X-ray crystallography, shooting X-rays through crystals to see their internal structure. Think of it like taking a photograph of something invisible. Most scientists found this work incredibly difficult. Rosalind found it fascinating. She had an almost magical ability to capture clear images from substances that confused other researchers. Her colleagues called her the camera whisperer. But what happened next might shock you. In 1950, Rosalind accepted a position at King's College London to work on something called DNA. At that time, most people had never heard of DNA. It was just some mysterious substance found inside cells. Rosalind's job was to figure out DNA's structure using X-ray photography. Her new laboratory was in the basement, cold, damp, and poorly lit. Most researchers would have complained. Rosalind simply got to work. DNA samples are incredibly difficult to photograph. The molecules are tiny and fragile. Most attempts result in blurry, useless images. But Rosalind had supernatural patience. She would spend weeks preparing a single sample, working alone until midnight. Then, on a cold morning in May 1951, something extraordinary happened. Rosalind loaded a fresh DNA sample and pressed the button. When she developed the photograph, her hands began to shake. The image was perfect, crystal clear, and it showed something that made her heart race. The DNA molecule had a specific spiral shape, a double helix. She was looking at photo 51. In her notebook, she simply wrote, "Structure B, photo 51, helical structure confirmed." But here's where our story takes a dark turn. What Rosalind didn't know was that her discovery had put her in the middle of the biggest scientific race of the century. At Cambridge University, two ambitious men were desperately trying to solve the same puzzle. James Watson was a young American biologist. Francis Crick was a British physicist who talked too much and laughed too loudly. Together, they shared one burning obsession. They wanted to be the first to crack the DNA code. The problem was, Watson and Crick couldn't take good X-ray photographs. They were brilliant theorists who built beautiful models, but they needed real data. And the best DNA photographs in the world were in Rosalind Franklin's laboratory. At King's College, Rosalind was supposed to work with Maurice Wilkins, but from their first meeting, things went wrong. Wilkins expected her to be his assistant. When Rosalind made it clear she was nobody's assistant, tension filled the laboratory.
Miss Franklin, I think you misunderstand your role here. This is my project.
Rosalind looked up, her eyes flashing.
Dr. Wilkins, I was hired to solve DNA structure. That's exactly what I intend to do.
They barely spoke after that, but this wasn't just a personality clash. It was about to become the betrayal that changed scientific history. Watson and Crick were growing desperate. They had built model after model, but without good X-ray data, they were just guessing. The scientific community was whispering that maybe these two weren't as brilliant as they claimed. That's when Maurice Wilkins made a decision that would haunt him forever. In January 1952, Wilkins gave a talk at Cambridge University. Watson was in the audience. Without asking Rosalind's permission, Wilkins pulled out photo 51 and showed it to everyone. Watson's reaction was electric. Seeing that photograph was like being struck by lightning. The spiral structure was obvious. Everything he and Crick needed was right there in Rosalind's image. But Rosalind wasn't even there to see her own work being shared. She was back in London, completely unaware that her most important discovery had just been handed to her biggest competitors. Watson rushed back to Cambridge.
I've seen it.
He shouted to Crick.
I've seen the structure.
They worked feverishly, but they needed more information. The photograph showed the shape, but they needed exact measurements. Where could they get this data? Max Perutz, a senior scientist, had access to a confidential report that Rosalind had written about her research. This report contained all her precise measurements, everything Watson and Crick needed to complete their model. Perutz gave them the report without telling Rosalind. Imagine you spent months solving a puzzle, keeping careful notes. Then someone secretly took your notes and used them to solve it before you could finish. That's exactly what happened to Rosalind Franklin. Armed with her data, Watson and Crick worked around the clock. By February 1953, they had built a model that matched all of Rosalind's measurements perfectly. Two spiral staircases twisted around each other, connected by chemical rungs. On February 28, 1953, they walked into their local pub and made an announcement that would echo through history.
We have discovered the secret of life.
Crick declared. But Rosalind was still in her basement laboratory, still taking photographs, completely unaware that her life's work had been used to solve the puzzle she was so close to completing. When Watson and Crick published their famous paper in Nature on April 25, 1953, they barely mentioned Rosalind. Her crucial photograph was referenced in a tiny footnote. Her name appeared only in a brief thank you. The paper made Watson and Crick instantly famous worldwide. Newspapers hailed them as brilliant scientists who had unlocked the secret of life. Rosalind's paper, containing all her detailed evidence, was published in the same issue, but it was treated as supporting material, as if she had simply provided helpful data for the real discoverers. Was this really a coincidence? The woman who took the key photograph was treated as just another researcher contributing to someone else's breakthrough. Watson and Crick were invited to give lectures around the world. They appeared on television. Their faces graced magazine covers. Rosalind went back to her laboratory and continued working in silence. But here's where our story reaches its most tragic point. In 1956, at just 36, Rosalind began experiencing severe stomach pains. The diagnosis was devastating: ovarian cancer. Her cancer was likely caused by years of X-ray exposure. The technique that made her famous had been slowly killing her. She faced her illness with quiet determination, continuing to work even as she grew weaker. On April 16, 1958, Rosalind Franklin died. She was 37 years old. 4 years later, in 1962, James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins were awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA structure. Rosalind's chair remained empty. The Nobel Prize ceremony was everything you might imagine: elegant, prestigious, filled with celebrated scientists. Watson, Crick, and Wilkins accepted applause for their discovery. But there was an elephant in the room. The Nobel Prize is never awarded posthumously. Rosalind had been dead for 4 years, giving the three men the perfect excuse. She would have been included if she were alive, they could say. Even if Rosalind had lived, there's little evidence she would have been included. The Nobel Committee barely considered her contribution. For years, the three men lived with their secret. When journalists asked about other contributors, they would mention Rosalind's name briefly, almost as an afterthought. "Oh yes, Rosalind Franklin took some very good photographs," they would say. "Very helpful to our work." But calling photo 51 helpful is like calling the Mona Lisa a nice painting. James Watson particularly enjoyed minimizing Rosalind's role. In his 1968 book, he described her as difficult and unfriendly. He even nicknamed her Rosie, a name she hated, and wrote about her appearance instead of her brilliance. But people started asking questions. Science historians dug through old notebooks and correspondence. Slowly, the real story emerged. The first crack came in the 1970s when Anne Sayre, Rosalind's friend, published a biography revealing the truth about photo 51. She showed how Rosalind's work had been shared without permission and how her insights had been stolen. More evidence kept coming. Letters showed that Rosalind had understood DNA's helical structure months before Watson and Crick. Laboratory notebooks proved she had made all the key measurements they claimed as their own. Think about your social media posts. Imagine someone took your most creative content, became famous from it, then spent decades acting like they had thought of it themselves. That's what happened to Rosalind Franklin. By the 1980s, the scientific community began acknowledging the truth. Universities named buildings after Rosalind Franklin. Her photograph appeared in textbooks. The woman erased from history was slowly being written back in. Watson eventually admitted he had treated Rosalind unfairly, but his apology came decades too late. Crick became more honest about her role as he aged. Wilkins carried the guilt for the rest of his life. Today, Rosalind Franklin finally gets the recognition she deserved. The European Space Agency named a Mars rover after her. Universities worldwide have established research institutes in her honor, but recognition isn't just about naming buildings. It's about understanding what we lost when we silenced voices like Rosalind's. She wasn't just brilliant at taking photographs. She was a careful, methodical scientist who understood that real discoveries come from patient observation. While Watson and Crick built flashy models, Rosalind did the hard work of actually understanding what DNA looked like. What would science look like if we valued careful observation as much as clever theories? If credit went to people who did the work, not just those best at promoting themselves? I'd love to read your comments about this. These aren't just historical questions. They matter today because the same patterns continue. Women in science still struggle for recognition. Rosalind Franklin's story reminds us that the most important breakthroughs come from people working quietly, taking careful measurements and asking patient questions. When a young woman today looks through a microscope and sees something that could change everything, she can take inspiration from Rosalind Franklin. She can know that careful, persistent work matters more than publicity, that real discoveries come from dedication, and that her voice deserves to be heard. The woman who captured the secret of life in a single photograph has finally taken her rightful place in the story of human discovery.